The Oregon Trail in the summer of 1852 smelled like hope rotting into something else. It smelled like oxen dead 3 days in the heat, like river water that had passed through too many sick bodies upstream, like the particular sweetness of fresh graves dug in a hurry by people who had no time left for ceremony. 50,000 souls made the journey that year, selling everything they had built in one place for the promise of everything they might build in another, and by the time most of them reached the Blue Mountains of eastern Oregon, they had already left pieces of themselves scattered across 2,000 miles of continent. They were exhausted in ways that sleep could not repair. They were desperate in ways that made them reach toward any hand extended in their direction, without stopping to examine whose hand it was or what it wanted in return. Father Morai. Grayson understood this with the precision of a man who had studied vulnerability the way other men study scripture. Tall, gaunt, with gray eyes that held the particular intensity of someone who had long ago resolved every internal contradiction about what he was willing to do. He had arrived in Oregon Territory in 1851, claiming to be a missionary, and built his Sacred Heart Chapel on a hill overlooking a natural stopping point along the trail with the same strategic calculation that a hunter uses when selecting a blind. The location was perfect. Families who had traveled 1,800 miles were not thinking clearly about the geometry of the place, about why a chapel sat precisely where exhausted wagons naturally paused, about what the convenience of its position said about the intentions of the man inside it. Beside him was his wife, who had taken the name Sister Constance, a woman whose gentle manner concealed a methodical intelligence that was in some ways more terrifying than her husband's because it expressed itself through tenderness. She knew plants and medicines and the language of maternal comfort. She knew how to hold a dying child and speak softly about heaven while the dying accelerated beneath her hands. And there was Brother Ezekiel, Morai's younger sibling, a practical man with an honest face and skilled hands, the kind of man who could fix your wagon wheel or help you lift a heavy load and make you feel, in the warmth of his assistance, that the world was still a place where strangers helped each other simply because it was right. Together they created something that should not have been possible. A trap built entirely from the materials of human goodness. A machine for murder disguised as an answer to prayer. The Morrison family arrived first, or first in the way that history records things. The first whose disappearance would eventually be documented when investigators began working backward through decades of silence. James Morrison, his pregnant wife Elizabeth, 3 small children, and Elizabeth's elderly father had been traveling alone after their wagon train dispersed, confident they could cover the remaining miles without the protection of larger numbers. When their axle broke 2 miles from the chapel, Brother Ezekiel appeared within hours with the unhurried certainty of a man arriving exactly when expected. His words were soft and practical. Sister Constance had experience with difficult births. Father Morai would consider it an honor to provide shelter. The Lord had placed them near the chapel for a reason. James Morrison later told Territorial Records that the chapel had appeared like a gift from the Almighty. He could not have known that he was describing the mechanism of his family's destruction in the language of his gratitude. For 3 days everything appeared to be what it claimed to be. Sister Constance tended to Elizabeth with genuine skill and apparent warmth. Brother Ezekiel helped with the wagon repairs with the focused competence of a man who simply wanted to be useful. Father Morai offered spiritual comfort with a knowledge of Scripture that seemed authentic because it was. He had studied it carefully and honestly, not to believe it but to use it as a man uses any precise tool. The children played in the chapel yard. The old man rested his arthritic joints in a comfortable chair. Everything was normal in the way that a held breath is normal, technically, temporarily, and concealing tremendous pressure. On the 4th day, Sister Constance began administering her blessed remedies. She prepared them in the chapel basement where no one was invited to observe the process, carrying them upstairs in small clay cups with the careful attention of a woman who understood exactly what she was carrying. The arsenic had been obtained from local mining operations under the pretense of pest control. She had spent months determining the correct doses, the precise quantities that would produce the convincing progression of trail sickness symptoms, without accelerating so rapidly that the timeline became suspicious. Stomach cramping first, then nausea, the grayish pallor that trail families recognized from the disease that had killed so many people they knew. Then the deeper deterioration, organ failure that arrived with the slow inevitability of something natural, something that fit the narrative of a body already worn to its breaking point by months of impossible hardship. Elizabeth's father was the first to die on the 7th day, and Father Morai performed a burial ceremony of such genuine feeling that Elizabeth wept not just for her father, but for the grace of finding such compassion in such a desolate place. Then Tommy, age 7, then Mary, age 5. Each death accompanied by elaborate ritual, each grave dug in the grove behind the chapel, where the trees were already thick with previous plantings that no one passing on the trail could see. Each night after the grieving survivors had exhausted themselves with prayer and weeping, Brother Ezekiel moved through their wagon with a candle and a ledger, cataloging everything with the patient efficiency of a man who understood that precision in accounting was the foundation of sustained enterprise. James Morrison died on the 14th day. Elizabeth delivered her son hours later. The infant lived long enough to be baptized by Father Morai, who spoke over him with what witnesses might have taken for genuine tenderness. 3 days later, Elizabeth was gone too. The entire family had been consumed in less than 3 weeks, and the graves in the grove behind the chapel received their new residents with the quiet permanence of good record-keeping. What Morai understood and had articulated to his family with the cold clarity of a man who had thought something completely through was that the Oregon Trail was the perfect hunting ground, not despite its horror, but because of it. The trail was already killing people constantly and visibly. Entire families died of dysentery, cholera, fever, accidents, starvation. The baseline of death was so high, so accepted, so woven into the expected texture of the journey, that a family annihilated by arsenic in a remote chapel was simply indistinguishable from a family annihilated by cholera at a creek crossing. The grief was the same. The graves looked the same. The story told by survivors had the same shape as every other story of loss on that terrible road. He had discovered something that he recorded in his leather-bound journal with the dispassionate precision of a naturalist logging an observation. That evil performed with sufficient patience and intelligence becomes indistinguishable from ordinary misfortune. That people in grief do not investigate. That religious authority in a desperate landscape operates as a nearly impenetrable shield, because to question a minister's charity is to question God's provision, and people who are watching their children die cannot afford the additional devastation of doubting the only comfort available to them. The journal was the most disturbing document investigators would eventually uncover, more disturbing even than the grove of unmarked graves or the hidden basement compartments sorted by category. Valuables kept, valuables to be sold, items too personal to risk selling, items that could be melted down to eliminate identifying marks. The journal read like a business ledger written by a man who found the work genuinely interesting. Entries recorded family names, dates, possessions cataloged with estimated values, disposal methods noted, profits calculated, lessons learned annotated for future reference. A typical entry was 3 sentences long. Its brevity was the most horrible thing about it. Typical entry, Morrison family, 5 souls. September through October 1852. Method arsenic via medicinal teas over 17 days. Possessions yielded approximately $400 in gold and trade goods. Lesson learned. Reduce dose frequency to extend timeline and reduce survivor suspicion. By the end of 1853, they had murdered 23 people across 7 families. By the end of 1854, the number had climbed past 40. The operation had been refined in every direction simultaneously. Brother Ezekiel had established relationships with black market dealers in multiple communities, spacing his sales carefully, presenting different categories of stolen goods to different buyers, constructing a plausible identity as a man who bought and sold salvage from failed wagon trains. Sister Constance had expanded her pharmacological knowledge to include faster and slower acting variants, depending on what the timeline required, learning to read each family's suspicion level and adjust her approach accordingly. Father Morai had developed a sophisticated psychological profiling system, reading people's denominational backgrounds and fears within minutes of meeting them, adapting his theological register to provide exactly the flavor of comfort that would lower their defenses most completely. The summer of 1854 brought the family that almost broke them. Charles Wetherbe was a former Confederate officer traveling west with his wife Margaret, twin daughters aged 15, and Margaret's younger brother David. He had his wife's intelligence and his military trainings, instinct for threat assessment, and from the moment brother Ezekiel appeared on the trail with his too convenient timing, Charles felt the wrongness of it in the way soldiers feel things, not as a thought but as a physical sensation located somewhere in the chest. He resisted the initial invitation. He continued to watch everything. He asked questions that other victims had not thought to ask. He noticed when brother Ezekiel's eyes lingered on his possessions with an attention that was not quite casual. Father Morai adapted with the fluency of a man who had been adapting to obstacles his entire criminal career. He acknowledged Charles's suspicion directly, which was the most disarming thing he could have done. He pointed out that a trained soldier would be a difficult target, which made the idea of being targeted feel less plausible. He demonstrated openness and patience until Charles's defenses, eroded by weeks of subtle psychological pressure, began to soften. Sister Constance administered the arsenic in doses so small and gradual that the symptoms developed over 6 weeks, appearing to be nothing more than the accumulated physical cost of months on the trail. David died first, then Margaret. Charles, weakening but still thinking, found the hidden basement compartments on a night when he could no longer sleep. He held a stranger's pocket watch in his hands, a child's doll still smelling faintly of the child who had owned it, an undelivered letter from a woman describing the kindness of the Christian family caring for her sick children. He understood everything in the time it took to read that letter. He went to his dying wife and told her they needed to leave immediately. He was too late for himself. The Graysons had noticed his growing awareness and accelerated his poisoning. He died the next morning with the knowledge of what had happened to him, which was perhaps the cruelest thing they had done to anyone. The Patterson family arrived the following year, and Catherine Patterson, Emily's unmarried sister, was the first person to survive the Graysons with her testimony intact. She had grown up in Ohio as the daughter of a pharmacist. She recognized the white crystalline powder Sister Constance added to medicines as something other than blessed salt. She noticed that the sickest family members were consistently those who had been most compliant with Sister Constance's medical regimen. She stopped taking her medicine on the 4th day and convinced young Timothy, the youngest child, to do the same by telling him it was a game. When Father Morai found her at the wagon in the early hours of the morning, moving with the particular quiet of a woman who had decided something, his expression told her everything she needed to know about what the chapel's hospitality actually cost. He moved toward her with his hand beneath his coat, and Emily appeared from behind the wagon with Thomas's pistol, and Catherine brought an iron tool down on Morai's head with the controlled desperation of a woman choosing between bad options in a situation that offered nothing better. They fled with Timothy and without the rest of their family, because the rest could not be moved and because Catherine had made the calculation that saving 3 lives was not a lesser thing than saving none. Emily, poisoned for weeks, died within a year of their escape. Her body had been damaged beyond what recovery allowed. Timothy grew to adulthood without ever fully sleeping through the night. When military investigators reached the Sacred Heart Chapel, they found Thomas Patterson and his 3 older children dead of arsenic poisoning and the Graysons gone with most of the basement's contents. What remained in the hidden compartments was enough to begin understanding the scale of what had been happening in those hills for 3 years. Possessions from dozens of families. Father Morai's journals documenting every murder with businesslike brevity. maps indicating the locations of unmarked graves in the grove behind the chapel. The Graysons ran for 2 years, reinventing themselves in Northern California as the Morrison family, operating the mission of Divine Mercy, which was the Sacred Heart Chapel made larger and more efficient, positioned to intercept families traveling between Oregon and California. They had learned from the Patterson escape. They had recruited local accomplices to serve as lookouts. They had developed faster methods for family annihilation, dissatisfied with the inefficiency of gradual poisoning when circumstances required speed. They had been operating at the new location for months before federal marshals, following the operational patterns Catherine Patterson's testimony had described, found them. The raid came at dawn on June 15, 1857, and this time there was no escape. The basement of the Mission of Divine Mercy contained possessions from more than 20 families. Father Morai's journals documented a criminal enterprise stretching back to 1845, predating even the Sacred Heart Chapel, a decade and a half of methodical murder across multiple territories. The bodies numbered in the hundreds, the victims nameless in every record except his own. At trial, Father Morai showed no distress when presented with evidence of his crimes. The charming authority of the preacher had been replaced by something colder, a man explaining a philosophy he had arrived at through genuine reflection and still believed. He described his victims as weak, their possessions as resources misallocated to people who could not survive the challenges of frontier life. He described himself and his family as instruments of a natural order that rewarded strength and efficiency. He spoke without remorse because he felt none. The moral corruption that had allowed him to begin had deepened over 15 years into something that no longer recognized the thing it had corrupted. Sister Constance expressed anger at being interrupted rather than regret for what she had done. She insisted that the family she had killed had been suffering, and that she had provided mercy along with a swift conclusion. The self-deception was total and genuine, which was in its own way the most disturbing thing about her. She had found a story that made her actions feel like service, and she had told it to herself every day for 15 years, until it had replaced whatever else had been there before. The investigation eventually connected the Graysons to more than 800 deaths across the Oregon Trail and its surrounding territories. The actual number was likely higher. Most of their victims had been transient families whose disappearances fit neatly into the acceptable casualty rate of westward migration, absorbed into the general tragedy of the trail, the way individual drops are absorbed into a flood. Father Morai was hanged. Sister Constance received life imprisonment. Brother Ezekiel received 20 years for his role as the operations logistics manager, the quiet, practical man who had kept the whole enterprise running with the same uncomplaining efficiency he had always applied to useful work. Catherine Patterson spent the remainder of her life working with frontier law enforcement, helping to establish better systems for tracking missing families and investigating suspicious activities at remote religious sites. She never stopped seeing Morai's face in her memory, that moment on the trail road when his expression shifted from pastoral to predatory in the space between one step and the next, the mask dropping just far enough for her to see what had always been underneath it. She built her life around making sure other people never had to see that expression for the last time. The Sacred Heart Chapel was burned to the ground in 1858 by local settlers who wanted no monument to what had happened there. The grove behind it was excavated and the unmarked graves were given proper markers, with the names recovered from Morai's journals, names that had been recorded in the ledger of their murders, given back to them as something else, as evidence that they had existed, that they had traveled toward something they believed in, that they had deserved better than what the hills of eastern Oregon had provided them on the road toward everything they had hoped their lives might still become.